writer and an editor, but before anyone becomes either of those things, she usually starts life as a reader. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I love to read. I have so many favorite books, so many favorite writers. If you had asked me 5 years ago who my favorite writers were, I would have said Robert Penn Warren, Ernest Hemingway, Vladimir Nabokov. If you ask me now, I'd say, well, Rachel Kushner, for one, and Lauren Groff, and Emily St. John Mandel, and also Robert Penn Warren, Ernest Hemingway, Vladimir Nabokov. See, half of my favorite books are classics written by men, and the other half are great new novels, all written by women. I work here in Lincoln at the University of Nebraska as the managing editor of Prairie Schooner. It's a literary journal housed in our English department since 1926. That makes us one of the top 10 oldest literary journals in the country, right here in Nebraska. But a lot has changed since 1926. We don't only publish Nebraskan writers anymore. We don't only publish white people anymore. We don't only publish men anymore. Now, we publish Nebraskan writers alongside writers from all around the world. White writers alongside writers of color. Men alongside women. The conversation keeps getting more interesting. Subscribing to or reading a literary journal or two is the best way I know to keep up with what's new and interesting in the publishing industry. Finding a new story, a great story, or a new poem that shows me a new way to see the world. It's a really exciting job. What we're publishing in literary journals today serves two main purposes. One is to reflect the contemporary landscape of literary publishing, and the second is to affect it. This first function serves readers. Someone subscribes to, say, The New Yorker because he wants to know what's good and new in fiction. So he reads a great story and thinks, I like this guy. I wonder if he has a book. And if he's publishing in The New Yorker, you can be pretty sure he has a book. So in this way, magazines become tastemakers. They're telling you what to read. The second function serves writers. Publishing in literary magazines is sort of the corporate ladder climbing for up-and-coming writers. You publish a story here, publish a story there. Pretty soon people will start recognizing your name. You get a little bit of street cred. Maybe you get a literary agent, a book deal. Good lit mags are a good indicator of what good writing looks like today, and they're shaping what good writing will look like tomorrow. In effect, literary magazines and their editors are deciding what you'll get to read. And it matters who decides what you get to read. When I was in 5th grade, our mother hen librarian, Mrs. Hendon, got to decide. I went to a small Catholic school in Kentucky, and there were about 50 kids in my class, 45 of whom were troublemakers. I, of course, was in the elite 10% of really good, upstanding students, but either way, we were all dying to read R.L. Stine's series, Goosebumps. You guys know the books I'm talking about? And we were so excited for 5th grade because in 5th grade, you would finally get to read these books. For those of you who don't know, I hear they're full of vampires and ghost stories and all kinds of scary stuff, but actually, I wouldn't know. Because Mrs. Hendon knew just what my classmates and I were capable of, and she knew that we didn't need any more inspiration for weird pranks or fake hauntings, and so when we finally got to 5th grade, the rule changed. The privilege shifted. Only 6th graders could read Goosebumps now. And when I got to 6th grade, you guessed it, not till junior high, I've still never read a Goosebumps book. And honestly, I'm still a little mad about it. I mean, they are just ghost stories, but I feel like I somehow missed out on some essential part of what childhood in the mid-90s looked like to the rest of my peers. Ultimately, I trusted Mrs. Hendon. I'm sure she had good intentions, our best interests at heart. And actually, we probably read very good books instead of Goosebumps. No offense, R.L. Stine, but it matters who gets to decide what you're reading. Kids learn young who they can trust, and librarians are often some of those people. I'll always be thankful to the librarians I knew as a kid, and I hope librarians everywhere keep fighting the good fight, because Even when censorship doesn't look and feel like censorship, it matters who's making those decisions. You want to read the best stuff out there from a variety of voices. You want to read what you want to read. And it was easy to trust Mrs. Hendon. For this young woman, it's a little bit harder to trust the unseen editors with their unknown agendas somewhere out there in the world, especially when so many of them are men. Now, nothing against men. I love plenty of men. There are plenty of male editors, plenty of male writers who I admire deeply and truly, but I'm not one of them. And as a young female writer, I need to believe that female writers are producing some really brilliant work. So why don't we see more of it? In the world of literary magazine publishing, there's an all-volunteer organization called the VITA Count that's keeping track of just how much writing by women we do see. Their process is simple. Count the number of pieces published by women and compare that to the number of pieces published by men. Some of us might be bristling already. It's an imprecise science, we're worried. There are so many confounding variables. But I think the real issue is that we want to believe that nobody needs to keep watch, that nobody needs to count. We want to believe that the editors are just going to publish the best stories and poems that are out there, regardless of who wrote them, whether they were male or female. Of course, some pieces will be published by men, some will be by women, some will be by white people, some will be by people of color, some will be written by Americans, some by people from countries all around the globe, right? You'd like to think this will all work itself out naturally, but it hasn't, not yet. The VITA Count's initial numbers were pretty sad. Imagine a pie chart where red means men and blue means women. Imagine a blue sliver of that pie so small that you'd be furious if someone gave you that piece at Thanksgiving. We're talking pretty dismal numbers for women. The VITA Count reveals major imbalances at major publications in both the US and elsewhere. Take, for example, the New York Review of Books. Back in 2010, they published 306 reviews of books written by men and 59 reviews of books written by women. That's only 38% of the pie. And it isn't because there aren't as many books published by women. Of course, the numbers sat like that for a couple years, but they finally got a little momentum. And by 2013, by 2014, the numbers had started to change. Last year, they had almost reached parity. 47% of the reviews they published were of books written by women. It sounds like progress, right? I thought so, but recently I heard a critique of a literary journal that's consistently published about 60% female writers over the past few years. A pretty good number if you ask me, but the criticism I heard came from a man who said, well, if you're only publishing female writers, then I want to unsubscribe. And my first thought was, only publishing female writers? Because 60% is hardly only. And my second thought was, unsubscribe? Oh yeah, man? Well, I want to unsubscribe from the whole history of the publishing industry, of education opportunities, of career trajectories, and voting rights, and pants. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not interested in crunching numbers just to crunch numbers, so let's set the numbers aside for a minute. And imagine with me a literary magazine that's publishing the same story over and over and over again. Maybe it has somebody different's name on it. Maybe the characters even have different names, but essentially we're talking about the same basic kind of story, using the same vocabulary, set in the same place, featuring the same types of people, and told from the same perspective. Now, in the best case scenario, you actually like this story. Maybe you relate to this story, you're super interested in it, you feel comforted by it, compelled by it. You could read this story over and over. But even things you think you love, you read them enough and they get a little bit boring, or at least uninspiring, and at worst, unchallenging. So at Prairie Schooner, the journal where I work, our editor tried something different. He invited a guest editor, a brilliant poet named Alicia Ostreicher, to help us curate a special poetry portfolio featuring the theme of women and the global imagination. What she pulled together was about 80 pages of poetry by 32 different women from around the world, from Tel Aviv to Manhattan to California to Zimbabwe to Havana to Japan to Indiana. In her preface to this portfolio, Ostreicher wrote, "Imagination is a key word here." So after a few years of the publishing industry getting a little bit embarrassed, these editors, these famous magazines, doing their best to defend themselves against these accusations of sexism and gender bias, we got a little bit of momentum. People have finally started paying a little more attention, talking about the question of gender disparity in the publishing industry. There are some opportunities for women, and there could be more. The Veed account has done some very good work to bring the issue to the public's attention. More writers I know, more editors I know are talking about it and coming up with more and more solutions, or if not solutions, then experiments, attempts. I've seen more calls for submissions from women, more women-only issues or portfolios like ours, more reviews of books by women, more books by women on display in local bookstores. One blog posed an interesting challenge. What would a year of reading only women look like? I know people who tried it. They said they found some brilliant books, some writers they would continue to follow. But here's my confession. I didn't try it. I didn't want to be reading books by women just to be reading books by women. I didn't want some political agenda interfering with my reading for pleasure. I wanted to read what I wanted to read. The skeptical classics lover was me. But it just so happened that I got a job writing book reviews, and I read on assignment, so I spent a lot of time reading whatever book showed up in my mailbox. I loved some of them, I hated some of them, I reviewed them accordingly, but these were assigned to me, these new books, these not classics, and I wasn't thinking at all about who wrote them, whether they were men or women. I assumed that was the editor's responsibility, if I even thought about it at all. So, over the holidays that year, when I sat down to write about what had been my favorite books I'd read over the course of the past 12 months, I was surprised to see that of the 12 books I wrote about, 6 of them were by women. See, I had been choosing what I read, and I had been choosing the same thing over and over and over again. I'd been choosing books I expected to like, books I had expectations for, books I had heard were good, books that were written by men. And this forced variety of the books I was assigned totally transformed my taste. Now, people read for a ton of different reasons. Some people read to see the world. Some people read to see themselves within the world, to imagine what another life might be like. And giving people, and especially young people, interesting, courageous, and powerful representations of themselves within literature is so crucial. On the Prairie Schooner blog, we invited more writers to write in, writers of all stripes and all genders, to keep the conversation going about this question of women and the global imagination. What more is there to say about it? One writer and editor named Emily Vizzo wrote a blog post that examines some of the favorite books of our childhood. She says, "Stories love women. The imagination has a recipe for women." And she picks apart some of these books that I grew up loving, that probably many of you grew up loving, which on their own, many of them are great books, but she sees a pattern where there are only so many stories that are getting told about girls. They're either breathtakingly beautiful or unfortunately homely. They're maybe set into the wild against all odds to survive, or they're doing their very best, they're selling their hair, they're doing anything they can to support their families. These are great stories, But these are not the only stories about and for women. Is that all we want to imagine? For ourselves, for each other, our sisters, our mothers, our daughters? In her preface to the portfolio, Ostreicher made her point quite clearly. There is no narrowly defined female aesthetic here, she wrote. And what she means is that there isn't anything necessarily essential to these poems that makes them so obviously by or for women. Many of them aren't even about women. They're about ticket stubs and crocodiles in rivers, dictators, the streets of Havana, DNA, nuclear pollution. The beauty of a themed portfolio on women and the global imagination is this, that it foregrounds the imagination as it winds itself around the globe like a cat between ankles, like a raindrop down a window pane, like oxygen through the bloodstream, just as vital and just as life-giving. Now, maybe you're not all writers, but I'd wager that more of you are more of a writer than you often let yourself believe. But still, even if you're not a writer, let's say you read, and I hope you'll read more. And by more, I don't only mean quantity, but also variety. My challenge to you is a simple one. Meet more imaginations. How you do that is up to you. Say maybe you don't read a lot, you read for work, boring legal documents or tech writing, you're tired, maybe you read the newspaper, maybe you don't. Pick up a novel for fun. When's the last time? Make it a novel by a woman. Or maybe you're someone like me who reads all the time, the next best thing. How about if the next 3 books you read were written by women? How about if none of the next 3 books were written by Americans or even British writers, but writers from South America, Asia, Africa? There are so many things you can do. You can count the books on your bookshelf. You can diversify them. You can subscribe to journals and magazines and newspapers that publish women, and you can unsubscribe from those that don't. The idea translates, too, as you see movies, as you look at art, theater, listen to music. Pay attention to the voices that you're seeing and the way they're represented. Reach for variety. One of the best things you can do is talk about it. Talk to your friends, your families, your communities. Write to editors, call up librarians. Tell them you want to see more work by women. And one of the other best things you can do is imagine. Imagine a bigger, better, wider world with art oozing from every corner. Because it matters who gets to choose the books that you're reading. And if you're lucky enough that you're choosing for yourselves, don't reach for the status quo. Meet more imaginations, because when writers and readers imagine together, there's no end to the worlds we can create. Thank you.